Thanks everyone for coming today. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. This is Philip Cox's first solo exhibition in our gallery. Philip has shown with us quite a number of years ago. We used to have these architects drawing exhibition, so we do it biannually. And Philip has been involved in all three of them. But we never had a solo exhibition by Philip, and a lot of people didn't realize that, you know, his artwork is so diversified as well. But this exhibition, a lot of it is landscape around the South Coast. But Philip is really a contemporary Renaissance man. You know, really, he's, you know, like, I mean, you all know Philip's architecture, you know that he's a fantastic architect, but obviously not everyone is aware that he's such a good artist also. But also he's, like, you should go to his property down South Coast. He's got a beautiful garden there, and he basically curated and planned everything, and, you know, everything himself, well, not physically, but the planning. And so to find out a bit more about Philip, we have the perfect person to do that, John McDonald, art critic and film critic from Sydney Morning Herald. And so I'm sure John will come up with a lot of interesting questions for Philip to respond to. So I'd like to welcome both of them.
This microphone sounds a little bit...
You want to turn it down a bit?
It just seems a little bit kind of popping and,
Yep.
and bumping and making loud noises. How's that? It's a bit more civilised. I'll just say, Philip, before we sat down here, that he in fact was the first person I ever wrote about for the newspapers. Much to his...
We're all getting older.
I mean, I know that people think that was back in the 1930s or something. I assure you, it was 1984, and I had just strolled into the Australian with my student newspaper articles and said, "Can I see the arts editor?" And they said yes. They sent me straight up to see the arts editor. The arts editor said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "I'd like to do some writing for you." And she said, "Well, what would you like to write about?" And I said, "Oh, the arts." And she says, "Okay." And she handed me the recent publication on the work of Philip Cox, which was my first piece for the Australian in those days. So this is before they let me write about any artists whatsoever. But of course we mustn't class Philip as an artist, so perhaps we should say he's the #1 artist on my repertoire after all those years. But we all know him as something who, he's built a few buildings in his time, he's done urban design. He dabbles in architecture as well as But I'm wondering, Philip, I mean, are you still designing buildings, or have you gone completely over to the other side?
No, well, I'm still designing buildings, but very selective ones, and they're mostly overseas, they're not in Australia. I have a love affair with China, and I think Jackie Menzies would know that I've had a great love of Oriental art, and it was a part of Visasia, which Jackie and Edmund found in the Art Gallery in New South Wales. And so that love of the Orient and the love of China has continued. So I'm working in Guangzhou and Beijing still. I've completed the big maritime museum in Beijing, which is quite a huge, I think quite a marvellous building. And it was the last of the great buildings which the Chinese government gave out. But since then, there's been, China's maintained a wonderful contact with us, and we love working with them, and we've never had any problems. And I've often thought with the current with ScoMo and Nakehead, what do you call it? Bald head. Whatever. I mean, the relationship between China and Australia isn't great, but we still get on well. I mean, they're still giving us commissions, not big commissions, but we're in contact, and there's no suggestions of any problems, you know, with China and ourselves, which is great. But So China is is a part of the scene that I'm interested in. And of course Malaysia, I'm doing some planning in Malaysia. I'm not doing very much in Australia, deliberately so. I've left that to the others and because of COVID, it's been extremely difficult to keep contact with overseas. But I think it's important that, with Australian art, with Australian architecture, that we integrate and keep contact with Southeast Asia in particular and China, and continue the liaison that we have with them.
Well, Peter Dutton has just warned China that if they have anything to do with the Ukraine, then there's no accounting for what we might do to them. So I'm sure this is a worry to you, but you better not pursue this line.
Well, I'm very worried that the government is saying you're banned from going to China or you're banned from working with China. Any crazy sort of idea could come into their head and banning people, such as it's happened with Russia, that banned enterprise with Russia. Well, that's fair enough, but I think that there's absolutely no reason why we should be banning anything or the way in which the government is conducting themselves in a political sense in China, I think, is abhorrent.
Well, I think we might have a change of government soon, so the possibilities exist of change. But your turn towards Asia, as an architect, it happened around the turn of the century. For the last 2 decades, a lot of your work has been focused on Asia, hasn't it?
Yes, they have. Well, it was by default and not by design that we got invited overseas. And the world's become very global, and in art as well, it's become a global situation. And so, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in South Africa, China, Malaysia, India, and New Zealand.
Okay, Phil. What about Australian architecture? Where's Australian architecture now? Because you've followed it all the way through the 60s and upwards. You were there when Australian architecture, you complained at one stage that Australian architecture was incredibly drab in the 60s and derivative, that we didn't have an Australian vernacular, that we didn't have an Australianness about architecture, and your own work addressed that. But have we lost that? Have we got into some new dimension?
I think we've lost that spirit of being Australian. I think we've become global. I think it's encouraged by government. The city council requires you to have an overseas architect. All the major buildings done in Sydney today are done by overseas architects. And very, very few buildings done by an Australian architect, which I find, just bloody stupid. But that's what's happened.
I remember I had this feeling when you're walking through Tokyo around Omotesando, and you have a succession of kind of extraordinary buildings done for the big fashion houses, one after another after another. And I often thought that some of those buildings would probably not even be allowed to be built in Sydney. There would be strictures and regulations and plans which would prevent them from doing so. This is the thing. I'm not sure that Australia's are you saying that Australia's a country that encourages the big name, big star architect from overseas? Would they bend the rules for those people?
Well, I think the idea is, the motive is most probably right in saying we want excellence. We want design and architectural excellence. But at the same time, the excellence is not necessarily to be found overseas. And you look at Barangaroo, the Wilkinson Ayres, James Packer's dildo, and you have, the rest of it is done by British architects all the way. There's not an Australian. The last piece of Australian architecture is King Street Wharf, which we did in the Maritime Museum. And they pulled down, the exhibition centre, which we did, which I think was a world-class building, and they substituted by absolute crap. And you go down there, it's miserable sort of buildings that they've replaced by, all through government greed and, not understanding urbanism and not having the spirit. And the politics of destroying what the Labor government had done in 1988, this determinism, we'll get rid of that and destroy it, have no memory of it. And substituting by absolute inferior architecture, which is a great problem.
And to what extent is architecture, I could say, and the visual arts, a fashion victim? There are fashions in architecture, there are trends, there are styles, there are moments when people start to say, oh, that, and that's boring, and then everybody says, oh, yeah, that's boring, then this is new, this is exciting. So the next thing you know, everything is built in that style. I mean, my personal thing that drives me crazy is that every time I go to Melbourne, they've built another building which is lime green or hot pink or yellow, pink and purple. And I just wonder what those buildings are going to look like.
Be careful, John.
I just wonder what those buildings are going to look like in 20, 30 years' time.
I'm sure Ron did a very good building down there, but I agree with you that there's nothing wrong with fashion in a sense. Fashion can be celebrated. I mean, we look at Victorian architecture or Edwardian architecture or 19 Art Deco or whatever it is, and there's some marvellous examples of fashion in that. But there's a strong philosophy that existed in that fashion, and there's a lot of inferior stuff that was done within that sort of vocabulary of that time. The trouble with today, I think, is technology. That the computer rules, and you get an incredible sameness. You can walk through the streets of Sydney, and it's like a piece of graph paper. It's very hard to distinguish one building from the other, except they're all glass, they're all detailed in a slightly kinky way. And the only exception to that is, the sort of evil, I think, that Frank Gehry did, that architecture becomes sculpture. I adore sculpture. I worship, people who do great sculpture. We've got two great sculptors here today. But to look at Mio buildings and where they are not necessarily functional, they're skins on something else. So you do a building and you wrap it. You wrap it in whatever contortion you like, and then that becomes architecture. But to me, that's sculpture. It's not really architecture at all. And to have too many of those buildings, within the environment, it's just, quite horrible. I don't think we understand urban design enough. We don't look at cities of the past and see that politeness and civility and being respectful of streetscapes and humanism above all. With multi-storey, construction, you lose that human scale that all the great cities that we love so much as Rome and Paris and everything are 5 stories. It used to be the old thing that you could shout from the bottom, you could be heard from the story above. If you couldn't hear somebody in the street, forget it, you couldn't go. And of course, there was fire, and there was also how many stairs were you prepared to travel before the invention of the lift. And, it'd be lovely to, abandon the lift and say, you've got to go back to horizontal buildings, and live with the earth, live with landscape, live a sensible life. I don't know what it'd be like to be living in the dildo. I think it'd be awful to be up at the top of that. I think unbelievably awful.
But I mean, they even talk about things like virtual architecture now. That the buildings become big screens upon which it's a perpetual light show, upon which you're projecting images and all sorts of things. So the actual sense of the made building, the materials, the construction, the framework, the skeleton, all that is played secondary to the idea of the image it's going to project, which is essentially a flat thing.
Yeah, but that's art, man.
That's
I think that's perpetrated by, what has art become. I mean, art has become screens. It's an illusionary. It's a different. It's not what you see on the wall here. It's a different technology, and I'm not knocking technology, but it's used in an indiscriminate way, I think.
What about architects and drawing? Because it used to be that architects would learn how to draw. I mean, at Sydney Uni, you had Lloyd Rees teaching drawing, you had Guy Warren teaching there. Over the years, that was always an important part of the architect's education, that you would actually, be able to draw. And a lot of artists, of course, were artists manqué. You've been painting and drawing for pretty much your entire career, and now you're getting a chance to get some of it up on the wall again. But there are a lot of architects out there who I think really have ambitions and ideas to be artists, but they just don't want to do it, or they can't do it.
Well, I had the fortunate experience of going to Sydney University and being brought up in the Beaux-Arts tradition. And I think that I was one of the last groups or years to have that Beaux-Arts tradition. So we were brought up to do classical compositions. We had to draw the Parthenon. And I have wonderful drawings, of Chinese ink washes, 400 washes on the drawing to simulate shadow, and doing the mentopes and the triglyphs and the flutings and all the rest of it on the drawing. It taught you, an incredible appreciation that if you labour over a drawing of a classical building, you learn much. You learn not only the drafting techniques, but you learn the appreciation of what the building is about itself, proportion, scale, the subtlety of entasis, the bulging of the columns, to correct the weight of the column itself, and so on and so forth. At the time, when I was at the university, I thought, why am I doing this crappy course? Why aren't we doing Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright? And why aren't we being taught the great masters of architecture? And because we had English professors who, Lutyens was the god, and we said, oh, bloody Lutyens, that romantic old crock, we don't want to know about him. But what we were taught with people like Lloyd Rees, Roland Wakeling, were the ability to draft, I suppose, because they were employed by the School of Architecture to teach us to draw, not to paint, to draw. And so we had this room filled with the most ghastly plaster casts. They were awful, these figures and heads and things like that. And we'd all have to sit around with our pads and with our pencils and draw these, repeat the image of the plaster cast. We had 5 years of the history of art, though, with people like Rees. Rees was not a great academic in terms of his knowledge of art, but what he had was enthusiasm. He could talk enthusiastically about any period of art. It was great passion, and he could instill in you a great appreciation of art. Roland Wakeling was quite different. He was a grumpy old man. He'd always you'd look at your drawings, and I remember, Rees and Wakeling coming up to Penny Seidler, and Penny couldn't draw for nuts, and he was always nice. Penelope, I'm sorry, I had to be corrected. And the only complimentary thing he could say was, "It's a very nice sheet of paper you've got there."
I have a story that about Mies van der Rohe. teaching students who were drawing and looking over their shoulder as he walked around the room. This was told to me by an old Chicago architect who I went around Chicago with one day looking at buildings. And he said, "You know, Mies, he was a really funny guy, Mies. You know, he didn't say much, but, you know, he had a presence. And we'd go around and he'd be looking at people, and he'd be looking at them, and he'd look over their shoulder as they're drawing. And there was this one guy, and he's doing this drawing. And Mies is looking over his shoulder, and he's looking, and he's looking, and he's looking for maybe half an hour. And the guy's getting real nervous. And then Mies says, "It's really boring." At least he gave it a go. So you're telling me that now that architects do all their designing on the computer, they're losing those vital skills, or they're losing something which brings them in touch with the building? They're losing a sense of the spirit of the...
Well, I mean, I suppose people of my generation are considered Luddites, that the computer is a foreign instrument, and where they say that you're completely out of touch using pencils or brushes or pens to draw. You don't draw, the computer does the drawing for you. I think we're so bound up by technology today that everything that we do is sort of second and third hand. You know, your telephone is second and third hand, your television, the screen that you're looking at the computer. It all becomes, a different vocabulary that influences what you're doing. It's different from the mind to the hand to the what you're drawing. The inspiration or the translation of what you see and what you put on paper is different from what you tap out on a computer. Typing out a message which does a drawing for you is a different mental exercise. And I'm not decrying it, but I'm saying it's a different thing. But the only, there are very few people that can paint with a computer. David Hockney is about the only artist that I know that actually uses the computer in a creative sense, in a visual way. The rest, I think, is very, very limited geometry that comes out of that.
Well, David tends to use the iPad and the computer like he uses the canvas now. I mean, the results are very similar, whether he's using the computer or whether he's using brush and canvas. But that's partly, I think, his total lack of self-consciousness. Whatever's there, he'll take it on, have a go.
Yep.
And self-consciousness is what kills a lot of things. Once you become very conscious of how things are made as opposed to the thing itself. And also, all of the stuff with the work on the computer, which of course is now essential to all of us. I mean, I write on a computer, we all design things on computers. It's a labour-saving device, essentially. It's a device which allows us not to have to do the hard work of writing and crossing out and chopping and changing. It means we don't have to remember everything and learn everything because it's only a Google away. But if you, for instance, in those people in Victorian times, those architects in Victorian times had bothered to read their way through things like Ruskin's books, like The Stones of Venice or The Seven Lamps of Architecture, which are colossally boring books. But if you had read through the entire Stones of Venice, which is about 1,700 pages in 4 volumes, boy oh boy, you knew everything there was to know about columns and volutes and architectural details, because it had been an enormous labour to get through it and to get there, and because it was important enough to you to actually learn those things. And I think that's the case with drawing, I think it's the case with education in general, that there's got to be a commitment to actually do the pain if you want to get the benefits from it. If you take the computer makes it all easy for us, and as such nobody remembers anything and nobody feels committed to anything.
Well, I can't use a computer to draw. I confess that. I can only translate by drawing something and then giving it to somebody else and saying, well, computerize it, which is most probably the wrong approach completely. But it's what the computer has done in architecture is give incredible freedom and perhaps a lack of discipline to what buildings are all about, because anything goes. Anything goes. I mean, any geometry can be created in a computer, where when you're creating something in a graphic sense, you're limited by the geometries that are known to you, either two-dimensionally or three-dimensionally. But we've got programs, aeronautical programs with sort of the most spacey things that, you can do anything. And you do it all by algorithms and all the rest of it. You can put in, 10 disciplines into the one solution through an algorithmic process. And it's quite extraordinary. You can go around the office with a screen on and you can see everything in 3 dimensions. But I wonder in the end, does it really pay off? Are buildings any better because of this? My answer to that is no, they're not, And they lack a human quality. They are very, very machine-like. They are very computed in a way that perhaps too resolved. They haven't got those mistakes of humanity in them.
Well, they haven't got the idiosyncrasies, have they? They haven't got those little touches and you're going to say something?
John, the one thing it seems we were hovering around is visceral. Art is visceral. It's tactile, it's visceral. And that is different from a whole range of other things.
Well, this is, it's true what you say, because there's almost a division, certainly in art, and maybe it's the case with architects too, between those who actually do believe that it's important to do the work yourself, to do the drawing or the sculpting, whatever yourself, and those who just believe it's a simple matter of having a good idea and getting somebody to do it for you. And there have been artists who've rung in their sculptures and designed their buildings, all that sort of stuff for a long time without no hands-on. But I really do think it is a totally different process. So I mean, even I've got you with your pictures here, Philip. I mean, they're very, very hands-on. They're very touchy-feely. There are thousands of little marks, pencil marks, paint, flicks of the paintbrush. These are not the works of somebody who just wants to create a product. These are the works of somebody who's deeply immersed in process and who enjoys the very process of holding the brush or holding the pencil and working with it.
Well, it's certainly in contrast to even architectural drafting, which is T squared, Z squared, the old system. It's a very different process. I think it's a release of discipline that I find, in painting, rather than the heavy discipline you have in architectural drawing. And that's where I suppose the joy comes in. And I think you have a different thinking when you're designing a building to when you're doing a painting or you're writing the genesis of the ideas might be there, but the process mentally, I think, is a very different one.
Well, I've always thought that to me, artists have to be inspired amateurs. I think it's all very well for artists to say they're professionals, and I've known artists who have been praised for their professionalism, but often it comes out in almost a negative sense. I remember people talking about what a great professional Jenny Watson was, because she could have, 3 shows in 6 months in 3 different cities. Well, she could have those shows because the pictures were stick figures and they were done by an assistant. So it wasn't as if it was a huge, Michelangelo-like effort in the studio. But professionalism, I think, is absolutely necessary if you are running a gallery, if you're writing, something like that. I mean, I have to be a professional in a way that I would not expect or perhaps even want artists to be. But architects, of course, have to be a bit of both. Architects have to be inspired, they have to have the imagination, they have to have the vision to be able to see the whole picture and to know what a building is going to look like and how it's going to feel when people are living there, but they also have to have all of those disciplines, from the engineering knowledge to the mathematical knowledge, so on and so forth. So it's a real mixed bag. I think what's interesting about your pictures is that the pictures here, the paintings, are almost like where you've taken a breather from all of the various disciplines and rigours involved with architecture. You've said, now I'm just going to stand and paint. Now I'm going to work with what's in front of me without having to worry about whether it's going to be able to stand up and whether the engineering specs are right and will support so much weight and so on and so forth. That's what I feel. There's almost a sense here that this is like the other side, that once you get in front of it, with a brush in your hand, you can take a breather from the rest of the time where you've been very, very busy building these things for large public occasions.
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. And perhaps when I'm doing a rendering, for a building, which I do by hand, I set up perspectives by hand, and which hardly any of the students can do today. The computer can do that much better. But also the computer can do what I do with rendering, the building, doing rendering of the building in the most realistic, photographic way. And of course that's what the clients love. They want to know what their building is, as if they can touch and see it in reality. So I'm out of fashion completely, excepting my Chinese clients love my watercolours of buildings. They say, do not give us all that crappy, technology. Give us some of your watercolours. So I'm encouraged by that some people on earth, do like returning to the handcrafted situation and seeing where the inspiration comes from, because a computer will never give you that accidental, feel of how a drawing or what's happened by accident almost in what you're doing, and which you can explore later, into a reality. So it's just a different world that we're living in. But the one thing that architecture has lost, I think, that since, even the Art Deco period had sculpture and architecture and painting and graphics integrated. You look at the buildings and the sculpture is, they use sculpture in the architecture use sculpture in a very, very good and explicit way. And then the Bauhaus sort of chopped all that. Sculpture was divorced and put as individual things rather than integrated. The last building in Sydney that had sculpture integrated in it was the Commonwealth Bank on the corner of George Street and York Street, which had a Lyndon Dadswell, Gerald Lewis, and
Tom Bass?
Tom Bass, I think. And the Lyndon Dadswell's still on the corner. The Gerald Lewis is on York Street, and I think it was Tom Bass, I think.
Tom Bass, I think, was relocated. I mean, Deutsche
Yeah, but they put a curtain wall over the whole thing, and which was an absolute travesty.
There were two Dadswells. There was a Relief, which wasn't Tom Bass. Tom Bass was in the...
It was Relief, it wasn't Tom Bass. He did so many, I probably wasn't.
But I think that was the last building that really consciously tried to integrate sculpture. And it's really marvellous to have sculpture, integrated into architecture in the city. I mean, all the curtain glass buildings, prohibit that. They are pieces located in a foyer or out in footpaths or something, and they really don't have very much contact with the building itself.
Well, when you think of, but of course, they were a lot of these pieces were so integrated with the buildings, which is really a hangover of ancient times of architecture, when decoration, sculpture, architecture were all seen as the same thing, and architects would design, the decorative additions and so on. But to the stage where like Tom Bass has had a third of his life's work destroyed simply because it was attached to a building. And when they've destroyed the building, they've destroyed the sculpture as well. And this has happened over and over again in Sydney, in lots of places, where they simply see the sculpture as part of the building. So when the building goes down, everything goes down.
Yeah, but I think that's a part of the, the strange quality that that Australians have of destruction of their cities. They're bent on vandalism. I mean, we would just say from the vandalism of Bridge Street, high Victorian architecture, it's the sandstone architecture. We lost the Royal Exchange, which was vandalism. We lose buildings that we should never lose. I mean, once you build something, it should be there, I think, reasonably permanently. It's wrong to squander monies, tearing something down and putting something, perhaps for whatever reason. I think it's money. I can't understand why buildings are being torn down rather than recycled. And you have the richness of history within your city. And now we've got a city that's so bloody boring with curtain wall buildings everywhere and glass. You daren't look up, you're only looking at the street, and hopefully the trees will grow so it becomes a green canopy around it. But it's a great travesty.
Well, we know what you think of Barangaroo, but what do you think? What about things like, say, the MCA? The MCA is in an undistinguished late Art Deco building, which is not really appropriate for a museum of contemporary art. But I still would have argued that they didn't knock that building down when they were thinking of doing so, because it creates at least an architectural variety around Circular Quay.
Well, I agree with you. It should have been. I think it's inappropriate. I know Andrew Anderson did quite a good job, but it's still a lousy gallery. It's not appropriate, and the additions are even worse. They're totally unsympathetic to the building, and they really don't work as a gallery space, and it diminishes the meaning of the older building anyway. But before the Maritime Services building was built after the war, and the commissariat stores, the Georgian commissariat stores, were there until the war years. And I mean, it's a beautiful Georgian building ripped out. So, I mean, we lost that, and it was a major building on the waterfront of Sydney, ripped down for the sandstone monster. And now we're venerating the sandstone monster. Yeah, that's great, but let's not go through this process where we tear down things and replace it by something that's inferior and doesn't pay, respect to the city as a whole.
What about something like the Sirius Apartments? What do you make of that?
Well, they chose the wrong building, I think, for brutalism. I don't think it's a great brutalist building by any means. There were the McConnell, Smith and Johnson buildings, the law courts, the Waterboard building, are brutalist buildings, and they are splendid buildings. They're lovely. The Waterboard has been desecrated. The law courts, thank goodness, survived. The law school was ripped down. The building that they did with I think it was in Pitt Street, was ripped down. But they were good, very good British building. I think the Sirius is tainted with, the arguments of social housing more than architecture. I mean, I think that it's a symbol there that you pepper the social housing in amongst the wealthy, and I agree with that. I think that's the only way you can solve housing inequity, is by peppering throughout the community rather than having ghettos of welfare that exist in Sydney and which don't work at all. But it's not, in my opinion, it's not a great building, and I wouldn't have been sorry to see it go if it had been replaced by something better. But I don't think it contributes to the rocks in any great way. In fact, the rocks should be a low-scale, development. Perhaps it was inappropriate in the first place.
Well, Would you agree with me if I said that it seems to me that if you could go back to sort of, I don't know, 1940 or something and just stop the clock there and go around and mark all the buildings that were the best possible examples of architecture to that point and preserve those, that's fine. But if we would look today where we are, most of those buildings would have been knocked down and destroyed. So what we've got now are the remnants. We haven't necessarily got the best buildings. We haven't got the best Georgian, Victorian, brutalist buildings, but we've got what hasn't been knocked down by sheer happenstance. And so people now are feeling like it's very important that we cling to those things.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you about the best, some of the loveliest buildings were the bank buildings in George Street, and they had the most magnificent sculpture, beautiful, it was sort of Victorian Baroque. They were fantastic buildings, and you still see the remnants of that around Martin Place and in George Street, where this robustness of stonework, and there's a great vigour and joy in these buildings, in materials, and that's real architecture. And you turn the corner and you see this glass, trivial, thing, that's a bit of graph paper, and you think, what in the hell is all that about?
Well, of course, this brings us to, I suppose, the big architectural question: Sydney modern. Have you got a view on Sydney modern?
I have to say, I think it's a disappointment. It's a great disappointment. I mean, I walk along Art Gallery Road and I expect to see something that arrests my eye. This curve that they've got in it is so subtle, I suppose, that it hardly registers. And as a building, it looks like a used car salesman, as a showroom. I mean, it's completely glass. And the only thing that is going to save it is the canopy that links it to the art gallery itself. But the gardens may be good, but it's a non-building, and I think that's the disappointment of it. It should have been a statement. Art galleries need to be statements, but they shouldn't be glass. I mean, it's inappropriate to have a glass art gallery, because you then have to put a box inside the glass.
And also it means that all the curators and directors are then people in glass houses.
Don't throw stones.
Or are they more hot houses? But you see, particularly museum architecture is also very much subject to changing ideas and fashions. It used to be that the only way that they would build an art museum was the white cube. So the Alfred H. Barr idea was that you had these white boxes with no windows, nothing distracted from the art, and it was like a laboratory space where the pictures were put on the wall. Whereas now, gradually the thinking became that it's better to have a little glimpse of the outside world, it's better to have some natural light, it's better to sort of soften the museum experience, because we don't want people getting bored or overawed or in these white cubes looking painting after painting. It's as though people cannot take the experience of going from room to room to room to look at art. They actually have to have a break. They have to look out the window, they have to go somewhere else. And what we've seen now is, I suppose, the logical extension, or rather possibly the absurd extension of the idea of this to where museums are mostly glass. In which case, where do you actually hang the pictures? But you don't need pictures, do you?
Yeah, but I think that a lot of it was derived from, and I remember Daniel Thomas agreeing with me that one of his favourite art gallery in the world, and my favourite art gallery in the world, was Louisiana in Copenhagen, which was an integration of visual spaces, external, but a delightful experience of rooms as you came, in the landscape. Unfortunately, the new Sydney Modern doesn't do that. It doesn't have that quality of integration. It is the pavilion glass box down the hill, but it doesn't register. When you're driving on the expressway, you can barely see it. And when you're in Art Gallery Road as a pedestrian, you're barely conscious of the thing. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's what the design thing.
There's a sense with architecture. It's a bit like designer labels. Like, I mean, to me, the ultimate one is the Liam Sampson Museum in Seoul, where the Sampson people had so much money they couldn't decide which superstar international architect they'd get to design it. So they got Rem Koolhaas, Mario Botta, and Jean Nouvel to design a third of it each. And they proceeded to put these designs by these three, superstar international architects into a suburb where the houses are packed so tightly that you virtually can't even see the museum. It's like invisible architecture from the outside. And you're just into there, and when you go from one bit to another, you know you're in a different architect's bit of the building. But it's a very peculiar thing, because it's almost like, you've got the designer label, but you haven't got anything much to distinguish the building itself. Everything feels a little bit anonymous inside.
I think that there's a similar building in Tianjin, which it looks like a shopping centre, and you have a central mall space, and there are 6 museums plonked all the way around it. You have a library, you have a museum of modern art, a traditional culture, and so on. It's an absolute bloody nightmare to go there.
Well, it sounds like a shopping mall.
It is, but they put a shopping mall underneath it. That's clever. That's going to make the money.
It sounds like Westfield's idea of a museum complex. But these, this whole, there's also the sense that people really, and they're going to do down in Melbourne now with the new museum that they're building there, where Angelo Candelapis has got the job. But the design looks diametrically different to what we're thinking about with Sydney Modern. This looks like it's going to be rather a kind of a grand fortress-looking place. I've only seen a brief glimpse of it on a JPEG on the computer, so I don't know much more about it. But to me, that looks like it's a kind of an older style idea, that it's going to be a big inclusive building where, once you're in there, you're in the belly of the beast and you're going to go and look at the art. It's not going to be full of windows and glass and hoping you look out. Quite, if you did look out, you'd only see the Yarra, so it's not a very exciting prospect.
Well, the result of new museums are really as good as the jury that select them. If you have a indifferent jury, or a jury that doesn't know exactly what they're doing, which I felt happened with Sydney Modern, the jury was not skilled enough to make the decisions they should have made. You get the result. You get a poor result out of that. I agree with you. Look at the new Powerhouse Museum at Parramatta. That's a fortress-like building, and it's a very, model building. It's certainly not a glass building. It's more solid than the glass box at Sydney Modern.
Again, to my mind, that's a building that should never be built. Even without considering it as architecture, simply considering it as $1.5 billion spent on something they shouldn't be doing.
Well, I was taking some Malaysians to the Powerhouse only a few days ago, and Lisa Havler was. I said, "What's the budget do you got?" She's 750 million. How about that? That's pretty good. That leaves Sydney Modern down the bottom.
This, of course, is the great joke about Sydney Modern, that when it was announced, it's been 8 or 9 years of constant fundraising to get the 300 or 400 million they needed to do it. And the government have been grudgingly coming on board to give them 200 and something million, and they've been trying to top it up with fundraising forever after, to the extent that it's dominated the entire mental process of the gallery. Whereas the government seems to have unlimited funds when it comes to trashing the powerhouse, building a bloody big new building in Parramatta in a floodplain, and also building a gigantic new storage facility in Castle Hill for some reason. When if they weren't going to get rid of the Harwood building, why would they need a gigantic storage facility in Castle Hill?
Votes, man. Purely political.
I mean, that's it. So but this, I think the pandemic has shown us that what governments say about budgets is completely unreliable. Like before the pandemic, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that. They had to balance the budget. There was no money for this, there was no money for that. $10,000, for a regional gallery. Oh, no, I'm sorry, we've got no money for that. But of course, there are now billions of dollars to be spent on all sorts of things where there's a political advantage involved, or where there's some, particular pet project to be put forward. I mean, money at the moment, post-pandemic, is just crazy. Nobody seems to have any idea about budgets anymore. It's as though they're just printing it.
Well, there seems to be plenty of money floating around. But one of the issues that I've never been able to understand why there hasn't been utilisation of the Bennelong undercroft of the park down there is this incredible space, this great cavern that could be used for, black box art in a most expensive way. You've got this lovely sheer wall of the sandstone, and you've got as much space as the powerhouse in this cavern. And it's totally it's not utilised at all.
Well, the cutaway under Barangaroo, where they're sticking a bit of the Biennale this time, I mean, that's a huge space.
Yeah.
That is such a big space that they could actually put another floor in there and have, I think Andrew Anderson's told me there would be as much space as the as Sydney Modern.
Exactly.
But potentially there's this gigantic space which is more or less just going to waste. And finally, and now the Biennale are doing something with it.
I think that it was offered to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, but they declined. They didn't like the idea of the satellite art gallery, but I think it's a pity that more consideration wasn't given to having a satellite down at Barangaroo, because it could have been a very exciting venue, in that location. Beautiful parkland on the water, it had so many attributes.
And what these pictures, which are all landscapes, obviously, your sense landscape is very important to you as an architect. I mean, that when you're doing a building, you're thinking about how it's going to sit in the landscape, how it's going to relate to the landscape, a particular view.
Yeah, well, landscape is the most important thing. And landscape, remember, is the medicine for all the bad things that happen in cities. I mean, you can blot things out with landscape. You can make spaces so much better with landscape. It's a very cheap and quick way of remedy. It's secure. We need more landscape. We need greater reverence to the landscape itself. And we're very, very lucky, in Sydney, that with Macquarie and Greenway, who knew about Capability Brown, and with the preservation of the headlands and the greening of Sydney Harbour. I mean, that was all done by design, not by neglect, or it wasn't used. It was done purposely, that it was on the romantic landscape of Capability Brown, and to have the marine villas, as accents on the harbour itself. Unfortunately, that's been eroded to a certain extent, but we've still got a very large proportion of those green spaces, which very few cities of the world, enjoy, and that makes Sydney. Sydney's only good for two things: water and landscape. The rest is shit.
It's almost a good place to stop. How are we going for time, Simon?
There's time to maybe a few questions from the audience.
Okay, so Philip's given me a wonderful full stop there. But as you can see, this conversation could be infinitely extended. If you'd like to extend it for a bit, any questions?
Do you think you have created metaphors of our landscape with your paintings? They're all dashes and goshes, and they've got sounds and movement and things like that. of landscape, of the harbour, etc.
Oh,
So,
that's a hard one. I suppose I see it that way. It was a strange feeling coming into this exhibition, you know, after it was hung. It was as if I'd come into a room and it was done by another person. I was looking around, you know, who's done this? And I really can't answer your question, you know, in that sense. You know, it happens, you know. When you're painting, it happens. There's no rhyme or reason for it, whatever's going on in your mind. And it's different to architecture where it's considered, you know, everything is considered in architecture. With painting, you do have that sense of freedom, which is a very, you know, enjoyable experience.
That's an interesting thought, actually, because a lot of artists will talk about that sense of being in the moment, which is precisely what you lose if you're one of the artists who rings up and gets your sculpture, you know, you order the sculpture over the phone, or you're like Patricia Piccinini and you just give the guys a drawing and say, go away and make that for me. It's that sense of being in the moment, being in the creative moment, and time standing still. And I mean, we all know, even people who write like me all the time, know that moment. You can sit there and like 5 hours have passed and you've got 2 sentences. But it doesn't feel like 5 hours have passed. It feels like you've been engrossed in what you're doing. Mind you, you think it's probably a bad day, so maybe try it again tomorrow. But it's, I mean, an artist once described that to me as the Lorca's idea of the duende, that sense of being completely and utterly immersed in that creative moment. Now, that happens in art, happens with painting, but it doesn't happen in architecture. Is there a duende for architecture?
Well, there's always the inspired moment. But that's you know, the process is such a long process. It takes a long development from the genesis of an idea to the creation, because of all those other disciplines that you have, you know, the structure and whatever that comes into it.
And is architecture a bit like making a movie? Like you can paint a picture by yourself, but you can't make a movie by yourself. You need lots and lots of people. And to make a building, that's another thing where you need a whole lot of people to do it with you.
You can do a house by yourself. You can do, you know, small scale architecture by yourself. And that's where Australian architecture has excelled in domestic architecture. I think that domestic architecture in Australia is some of the best in the world. But it's only by, you know, a handful of people that really are able to do that, and they do it with extreme skill and artistic fervour. But the rest of it, you know, isn't quite that. You know, when you get into a larger scale work, you must have a team of people. You've got, you might have, you know, have 100 people working on various disciplines, you know, to create that building. But there has to be that togetherness of the belief in the one idea of that is what you're going to do. You can't have people going off on tangents, you know, doing their own stuff on it. You should keep to the one idea. But many buildings suffer, you know, where it has dissipated into the dominance of something else.
Well, I mean, Cole Madigan would argue that's precisely what happened with the National Gallery.
I won't comment on the National Gallery.
Exactly. Well, that's another story.
I'd like to ask
Jenny, then behind. Yep.
a question. In relation to the old cities of Europe and the fact that there's so much value placed on heritage, in contrast to what's happening in China, where they're just completely destroying heritage for new and ultra-modern buildings. It's a real contrast.
Well, you know, thank you, Mao Zedong, for that, who, you know, during the Cultural Revolution that deliberately wanted a new China, away with the old, you know, welcome the new. And Chinese architecture until that period was a very slight architecture. It had been influenced by Russian architects who did most of the bigger buildings, particularly in Beijing. You go around, you look at the larger buildings, the Russian design inspired. But Beijing itself was a horizontal city built out of clay, brick and tile, and I remember giving a lecture in Beijing and said you must preserve the horizontal city, and you can adapt the hutongs to accommodate the same amount of people by engineering, you know, thing. And there was a Chinese, one of the officials got up and, I said, what did he say? He said, Philip Cox talks a load of crap.
I know a little bit about this sort of stuff myself. I mean, Chinese architecture, traditional Chinese architecture was very focused on the past, like Chinese culture in general. And so the idea was that you would reproduce the buildings of the previous era, and they were constantly burning down. Like the Forbidden City has been burnt down and rebuilt on umpteen occasions because they had these great big braziers there and they just catch fire, everything was wooden, bang off it went. They would rebuild it exactly the same every time. Because over the years, nothing is exactly the same. Things do change, things alter, there's a little bit of new technology, and so there was a gradual progress in difference of styles and different influences and that as well. But in the modern era, as you say, as Philip said, a lot of Chinese architecture was pretty undistinguished, and it was more or less just looking for ways to borrow reasonably cheap building styles from the West and sticking them up everywhere, or from Russia. But today it's a totally different mentality. I mean, in China now, the building is like a mania. It's like a crazy, you know, thing that, and everybody, after having been stuck for so long in relatively poor, you know, grotty, broken down little places, we're all living in courtyard houses with everybody living in 2 rooms and a central, you know, bathroom block in the set. They just are so in love with the idea that you just have everything new, that it was this great torrent of destruction. As if there was anything, whatever was left after the Cultural Revolution was then proceeded to be demolished, you know, systematically by developers and by civic people. And then coming up to the Beijing Olympics, some vast percentage of the existing Beijing was done away with in order to build stuff for the Olympics and to modernise the city. So China it's been wholesale destruction for a year or two there. When you went there, you were just, because there was so much dust in the air, not just from the pollution, but from the constant knocking things down and the building. But it is, I think, changing now. There are now Chinese people who actually are beginning to take the concept of heritage seriously. But it happens with affluence, because people don't think of that. We don't start to think about heritage. We don't start to think about preservation until we've reached a certain level of affluence, where we're no longer hungering for the bit of new stuff that we haven't had. Where now we can look back and say, oh, it would be nice if we had a little bit of older this and older that. But I mean, look for the hutongs now. The hutongs, there's a tiny number of them, and they're treated like tourist attractions. They've been Disneyfied.
But remember also that the religion was destroyed, and also the concept of the imperial family was destroyed, and anything associated with imperialism was meant to be wiped away. But the result of that, the worst housing I've ever seen, contemporary housing in high-rise, a la Hong Kong, because I think they thought Hong Kong is a great, you know, city, and you built tower blocks in housing people, which I think is about the worst type of housing for lower socio-economic groups. It's all right if you're, you know, $1 million and you want to live that way, but for family groups, it's an absolute disaster.
They did it in England too, didn't they? They built these terrible tower blocks everywhere, and they gave them all names like Wordsworth Mews and Shakespeare Court. Anyway, sorry.
I guess I'm interested in how all these beautiful works represent this other part of your life, which we know you better about down the coast. And I'm curious at this stage of your life, how the angst that you've just talked about with the politics of architecture is contrasted with your great respect, not just for nature, but for small towns. And what I see here is this it's just so peaceful and beautiful, and it's got respect for nature. And I would just wonder, with all that's gone on in the last few years, that you still represent the beauty of life this way, and how much is that influenced by your life and what you do down there, as opposed to everything else you've talked about?
Well, thank you, Sheena, for that. Sheena comes from the South Coast and has been one of the farmers of Four Winds concerts with husband Bill. And they share the love of the South Coast as I do. And I think we've discussed, aren't we fortunate on the South Coast that we're not like Byron Bay, you know, that it hasn't developed into this pseudo-affluent, you know, society of hippie culture and all the rest of it. The South Coast is forgotten. It's either too windy or too cold, or it's too far from Sydney and from Melbourne. It attracts more Melbourne people, I think, than Sydney. But the thing about the South Coast, because of its economic decline, it's remained pretty well intact. It's still villagey down there. There's only a couple of towns, Merimbula and Nabaruma perhaps, you know, that have developed into this hamlet type of development. But Bermagui, where we come from, it's just a few shops and that's a main street, and that's about it, and a golf course and a marina. The beauty of the place is the spotted gum forests and the natural environment, which is absolutely fantastic, and the coastline, which is breathtaking. This strange part of the coastline, which is tilted, it's been tilted, where you don't get that flatness in the beaches that you get up north. In the South Coast, you've got this ruggedness, almost cliff forms and big rock pools and crashing surf and things like that. And at the back of that, because you have the cliff, you're protected by the sea winds, and that's kept the forests intact. So you have the Botrytis and Gamiferum, which is a more twisted, stunted tree, and then that shelters ecologically the great spotted ash forests behind. And luckily, I was able, to acquire a bit of the South Coast 50 years ago, and we've kept that very much intact. And so people are now being able to enjoy the aspects of the various ecologies of the South Coast. But it's a very, very beautiful part of the world, and the paintings that you see around here reflect my love and passion of that part of the South Coast.
Yes, at the back.
I'm interested about your thoughts about the tiny house movement, mainly because the over 55 women as a demographic is now becoming the largest homeless population in Australia. So I'm just wondering whether whether you're personally interested and involved with any sort of solutions to deal with homelessness, like shrinking homes and changing about what we think we need for housing, so that we're... So is that too far from the conversation? Sorry, it is.
It might be a little far from the conversation, but I think it is a very serious issue. Homelessness is no joke, and it's increasing. And it is partly to do with our expectations of what we want from a house and a home. But the trouble is, these are things that we cling to because I think Australians, still like to believe that it's everybody's right to have a bit of space. It used to be that the Australian idea was that everybody had a suburban home. And if you remember what it was like in Sydney, 6 o'clock, everybody was out of the city was a ghost town, and they'd all gone back to their, what wasn't a quarter-acre block anymore, but it was whatever was left of a quarter-acre block in the suburbs. But now, with the crushing population is such and the urbanisation is such that things change, so we'd have to change our expectations. But changing expectations is one thing, and living in little boxes, to do it well, it's very hard to do, because psychologically, I think, especially in Australia, we need a little bit of space.
But we've always had, I wouldn't say homelessness, but when I grew up on the North Shore of Killara, and we had about 2 or 3 what we call swaggies who lived in the bush, and they were terrific, men who had a little tent, and they had their billy, and they used to boil their tea. We used to go and have tea with them. They chose to live that, they didn't want a house. They were bush people. And I think that perhaps that tradition still survives with people who are homeless, or homeless inverted commas, because I think that the amount of welfare that there is provided that you can get, accommodation at some point. You can do it, but there's an election to live in that way, and perhaps there's nothing wrong with that. People live on the street in Southeast Asia and like it. They want to. They like it.
It sounds like we're back at nomad land. but the problem also is that the way this country has been set up in terms of its negative gearing, interest rates, the whole thing, we've made such a fetish of real estate, and we've created a real estate boom that never ends, to the point where it's created massive inequality. The people have a lot of property, people have no property, people can't afford to get into the property market anymore. The problem is so big now that it's insuperable, and it's forcing people into homelessness, just who otherwise would be able to live a modest life in a relatively modest place. There's a lack of public housing, can't keep up. People who have one property have 100 properties. The inequality is just massive, and if you fix inequality around the world, you would fix virtually every single problem in the world today. Like Thomas Piketty, the French economist who wrote Capital for the 21st century, where it's basically a book this big, and on every single page he says inequality, 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 inequality.
But I think that Australia should have looked very, very closely with Singapore. The HDB, the Housing Development Board of Singapore, which has been the most successful public housing ever, where people are enabled to buy, and after years of being in a public house, are able to buy it through their rental, and the rental that they pay go to paying off the house. So in 5 years they own the place. So and are able to sell it. And I think that home ownership is so important in public housing. Rental is a disaster because people don't look after the property. They think the government should be looking after it, to care for it. There's a hole in the wall, government fix it up, change the light globe and all that. And that happens. If you own something, you look after it. And I believe the HDB is an excellent example of how the government should be exploring public housing in the future.
Yes.
Just thinking about Singapore, perhaps it's more in the older buildings from the HBD where there are breezeways. So you go and visit someone, and outside the door, it's not just straight into a lift or a cramped little route to the nearest lift. You've got where the kids can play and so on. And sort of moving on from that, with what's happening now with the effect of COVID on people. Well, I'm thinking we're sitting here in this lovely space, plenty of air to breathe, door open. Do you think that the design of these shocking glass prisons is going to change soon? You go down to Barangaroo and you feel as if you're absolutely imprisoned. It's hot outside because everything's covered in dark bitumen.
I think that you don't have to extend your imagination too far, that if you lose power supply, you lose life in these buildings. There's no windows to open, the lift won't work. If you're going to travel through 60 floors and to get up to your apartment, the air conditioning won't work, and so on and so forth. I mean, you just have a total collapse if you don't have power, to that. And that could easily happen at any point.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've just about wound it up. And,